AITA for making my son apologize after he made a racist joke about our delivery driver. So, I, 39F, need some advice. And I honestly don't know if I overreacted or if I was right in this situation. A week ago, something happened that I can't stop thinking about, and it's been really hard to shake off. It all started with an ordinary family dinner. My husband, 43 million, our two kids, 16 female, 13 male, and I decided to order Chinese takeout one night. It's something we do every now and then. Easy, delicious, no mess to clean up. We've been ordering from the same place for years, and we're all pretty familiar with the delivery driver, a guy named Mr. Lee. He's always been friendly, and we've never had any issues with him. So, the delivery arrived, and my 16-year-old daughter, who's an animal lover, was upstairs with the cat. We have a rule in our house: no pets allowed near the food. The cat is a sneaky little thing, and if we leave food unattended, he's going to try and snatch some. So, my daughter was taking him upstairs to her room to keep him out of the way. At the same time, I was standing at the door to take the food from the delivery driver. My son, who's 13, was in the living room watching TV. Now, here's where things take a turn. I'm standing there, exchanging pleasantries with Mr. Lee, and suddenly I hear my son shout from the living room, "Make sure you hide the cat from the Chinese guy." I froze. My heart dropped. Mr. Lee, of course, heard it. There was this uncomfortable silence for a split second, and I could see on his face that he was clearly taken aback. I was mortified, and immediately I apologized to him, trying to diffuse the tension. I'm sure I looked like a deer in headlights. I handed him the payment and closed the door quickly after that. I was so upset, but I didn't have time to react right away. I needed to handle this in a way that made it clear to my son that this wasn't something we could let slide. I asked him to come to my room so we could talk. And let me tell you, I wasn't angry in a typical, "I'm going to yell at you" way, but more in a calm, serious tone that let him know how big of a deal this was. I told him that what he said was completely unacceptable. I explained to him that racism, whether it's overt or in the form of a joke, has real consequences, and that even though he may have thought it was funny or just something casual, it was not okay. I told him how hurtful it could have been for Mr. Lee to hear something like that, especially when he's just doing his job. But here's where it all went downhill. My son wasn't having it. He got defensive and kept repeating, "It was just a joke. I didn't mean anything by it." I told him that's exactly the problem. People think it's harmless, but it's not. That kind of thinking can contribute to harmful stereotypes and hurtful behavior. But he wasn't getting it. He was just brushing it off, saying I was overreacting. After a long back and forth, I decided that I couldn't just let this go. I needed to do something that would help him understand why what he said was wrong. So, I made him do something I never thought I'd have to make him do: write an apology to Mr. Lee. I told him he needed to write a sincere, heartfelt letter to Mr. Lee, explaining why what he said was inappropriate and how he understood that it was hurtful. Then, on top of that, I made him write 2 one-page papers. One paper had to be on Chinese culture, something to help him understand the background of the person he made a joke about. The other paper had to be about racism, specifically why racist jokes perpetuate harmful stereotypes and how they contribute to a culture of discrimination. I know this sounds extreme, but I felt it was necessary. Racism is something we should never tolerate in our home, and this was a teaching moment for him that I didn't want to miss. I wanted him to reflect on his words and actions. The next day, I told him that we were going to take the apology directly to the restaurant where Mr. Lee worked. My son immediately balked. He didn't want to go. He was embarrassed, and I could tell he was dreading it. But I was firm. I told him that part of the lesson was owning up to what he said and doing what was right. He needed to apologize face to face, not just in writing. So we drove to the restaurant, and I asked Mr. Lee if he would be willing to hear my son's apology. Mr. Lee, bless him, was incredibly kind about it. He agreed to meet us and even invited us inside to sit down. My son, red-faced and nervous, stood up and read the apology aloud. It was clear to me that he was uncomfortable, but he did it. He then handed Mr. Lee the 2 papers he had written. Mr. Lee, in turn, was incredibly gracious. He thanked my son for the apology, telling him how much it meant to him. Then, in a moment that really hit home for both of us, Mr. Lee shared some of his own experiences. He explained how, as a delivery driver, he'd faced a lot of racist comments and prejudice from people over the years. He told my son about the times he'd been laughed at, made fun of, and even had his food thrown back at him because of ignorant remarks. It was eye-opening for my son, and honestly, it was eye-opening for me too. I don't think he realized how deeply racism affects people until he heard it from someone's personal experience. Afterward, we left, and my son was quiet in the car. I didn't say anything for a while, letting him process the conversation. But later that evening, my husband and I got into a heated argument about it. He didn't think I should have made our son go through all of that. He said it was too much, that it was embarrassing for our son to have to apologize in front of a stranger. He even said that the punishment didn't fit the crime, and that it wasn't a big deal. It was just a joke, he said, shrugging. I tried to explain why it was a big deal. I told him that it wasn't about embarrassing our son. It was about teaching him that these kinds of comments have a real impact. It wasn't just a harmless joke. It was a stereotype that can reinforce harmful beliefs and contribute to a culture of racism. I also told him that it was much more embarrassing for Mr. Lee to hear that kind of comment than it was for our son to apologize for making it. We argued for a while, and while my husband wasn't fully on board, I stood my ground. I felt that I needed to be firm about this, even if it made me uncomfortable. In the end, I feel like it was the right thing to do. I think my son learned a valuable lesson, even though it wasn't easy. But now, I'm second-guessing myself a bit. Maybe I went too far? Did I overreact? Was making him apologize in person and write those papers an excessive punishment? I'm really torn on whether I handled it correctly. So, AITA for making my son do all of this?